Incumbent President Vladimir Putin is running for a second term as an independent candidate, and the official election day is set for March 18th. Will Putin win yet again? And what does that mean for the immediate future in Russia? There is an ongoing TV and radio debate during the weeks before the election, but President Putin will not take part. Is the debate likely to influence the actions of the president in any way? China has an ongoing serious campaign against the kind of corruption, and what's happening with regard to corruption in Russia. Putin has resolutely denied any interference with US elections, presidential or otherwise. The US intelligence establishment, however, seems certain that Russian meddling was rife. Where is the US-Russian relationship headed now?
The 2018 Russian presidential election takes place on the 18th of March and is being preceded by a candidates' debate. Though President Vladimir Putin will not take part in the debate, he is widely expected to triumph in the election with little trouble. So what's at stake for the Russian nation heading into this election? What do opposition parties bring to the table, and what response can be expected from Putin if, as expected, he wins the office for another 6 years? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at China Institute of International Studies. We shall also speak via satellite to Professor Yang Cheng at Shanghai International Studies University and Russian defense analyst Pavel Fagenhauer. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Now, Mr. Cui Hongjian, the biggest question mark, I'm afraid, is whether Russia could be called a democracy in a Western sense.
Yes, exactly. It's a very, a big question, especially from a so-called Western perspective. Also, because of the change of some rules, some law, we can find out very long term for this President Putin. And also this time, I think a very, very big focus on this election is how could this kind of Putin-style politics continue in Russia, and how it gives some impact on the world politics development, as we know. Because so far, as we know, that President Putin become a very controversial figure. Not only in international community and also in Russia domestically, because as we know, some people support it hardly to regard it as a hero of a nation, but at the same time, some especially people regard it as enemy to democracy, anything. So I think that this time, I think Mr. Putin will give us another answer is how could its continuity and sustainability of this kind of Putin-style politics.
You are pretty dodgy and failed to give us a direct reply to the question as to whether Russia is a democracy. Let me cross over to our Russian friend, Pavel Fagenhauer. Hello. Pavel, President Putin is not the question. He will win anyway. That's the public expectation.
Somebody hear me? We lost IFB.
And the opinion poll shows clearly, Dr. Yang Cheng from Shanghai International Studies University. Can you hear me? The question is, Dr. Yang.
Yes.
President Putin is not the question. He will win the race anyway. The question is, can we call Russia a serious democracy? And I asked Cui Hongjian this question. I said, I raised this issue from the Western perspective. I'd like to have the Chinese perspective.
I think that from a Chinese perspective, it's quite clear that the Russian system, especially under the President Putin's leadership, that there have some different elements of the democracy. For example, the presidential election and the local election, and has parliament. There have some power structure among different parties, the party system, vote system, and so on and so on. So I think that formally, I think that the Russian under the Putin's leadership, there have some elements of so-called democratic institution. And in the 1993 year's constitution, there are also very clear definition about Russia is a democratic country. And Russia also described itself as a democratic country. Even Putin has several times criticized the American style, democracy. He says that you Americans are not, democracy. Actually, we Russians are because, for example, he said that he acted as a president. His voters, go to the streets, go to take part in the election, and one after one to vote for him. So this is a direct democracy, but America is not.
The other question, Dr. Yang Cheng, is whether Russia has a serious rule of law or independence of the media.
I think that it's up to, from what perspective. From Russian perspective, that they have a rule of law, and the Russian president, not only just under the Putin's leadership, I think even during the another president, Dmitry Medvedev, in their annual, address, a state of nation address, and different other, press conference before the public, they always stress that it's quite crucial for Russia to follow the rule of law, and they, especially in I think during the first and the second term of presidency, Putin made a lot to conduct a reform. One of the key reform is justice, reform, and to bring in a lot of new mayors to guarantee the rule of law. I think, but from the Western perspective, Western media always criticize Russia's, justice system, and it is said that there is no democracy and no rule of law, especially on the
I'd rather
strong
let
like
Mr.
Putin,
Pavel
authoritarian regime.
fight back. And he is a Russian. He's a Russian scholar, well versed with Russian politics and democracy. Now, Pavel, we have a strong Chinese voice coming from Shanghai to defend Russia as a democracy, and he says that Russia does have its own media freedom as well as rule of law. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of a glass half full or glass half empty. There is some media that's kind of allowed to exist, but of course the pro-Kremlin media dominates, and of course it dominates television, which is the most important part. In print media there's a bit more diversity. There is, of course, elections. There are opposition parties. They are allowed also to exist, but their influence and imprint on decision-making is practically zero. Though the Kremlin, of course, is very attentively listening to what the people believe, but mostly using polling sociological organizations. There are actually two majors financed by the Kremlin. They want to know what the people think, how the people will react. There were kind of incidents, say, in 2005, when some reforms caused mass discontent with Russian pensioners, and they don't want to run into such things in the future. So yes, it's not kind of a Western-style democracy, but it's not, of course, a totalitarian dictatorship. It's kind of something in the middle between that.
There's also yet another form of democracy in the Middle East, the Persian democracy, the Republic of Iran. Having said this, Pavel, there's no question about the strong candidacy of President Putin. He could leverage the resources in the capacity of the president, incumbent president. There's no question that you do have some opposition forces. Having said this, by the end of the day, the question is why did President Putin get so popular despite the scathing criticism about, whatever? Particularly, we have a very strong fire from the West.
Putin was appointed kind of president. He was appointed by President Boris Yeltsin to be his successor, and was rather an unknown figure when that happened. that happened in the very beginning of the Second Chechen War, which for Russia was actually a success militarily, unlike the First Chechen War, and that propelled Putin to popularity. Then there was this first decade from 2001 to 2010 when Russian economy was very much growing, and the household incomes were growing, and that, of course, made Putin even more popular. And then there was the 2014 and the reunification with Crimea, which made Putin even more national.
Does it mean, Pavel, does it mean, excuse me, Pavel,
Crimea,
does it mean Putin's popularity rose on the platform of nationalism since he took back Crimea and fought a heroic war, if not battle, in Syria to help push back the rebel advance?
Well, then, Syria per se is not maybe that's really popular because that's not really Russia at all, unlike Crimea, which is considered Russian. But success of Russian arms on the battlefield is popular anytime. And the Russian media, the state media, is projecting Syria as a military success. But yes, the national feelings created after Crimea, and the feeling that the West is against us, and that Russia is being surrounded by enemies, that's important, though mostly that causes in the ordinary people bewilderment that Russia is surrounded by enemies, as perceived. But anyway, that also means that Putin is going to be virtually unchallenged in his re-election on March 18.
There's the stereotyped question and image about President Putin from the Western perspective again, Pavel. He has a strong KGB background, and Western media always say, look, that makes a big difference for his presidency and the way he governs and runs the country. What's your take?
Well, actually, he came from the external intelligence service. He's not kind of KGB, meaning internal counterintelligence or kind of secret police. He's not from those sorts. He's not law enforcement. He was a spy in the GDR, and that gives a sort of a different, a bit bent. Though yes, he was a director of the FSB, the counterintelligence service, for some time under President Boris Yeltsin. And yes, he comes from the intelligence community, and of course that puts a big footprint on what he does and his attitudes. But he's not, I mean, secret police guy, and so though he has, of course, support within the intelligence community, secret police, counterintelligence, law enforcement, that's his agenda, yes.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for the clarification. Mr. Cui, what are the issues about the Russian economy? Because after all the campaign pledges and the major issues on the agenda of the strong presidential candidates will have to address issues of the livelihoods and the economic well-being of the electorate. What can you tell us?
Yeah, also we know that so far economy become a very interesting issue for all of the candidates. But now the question is, for any candidate, including President Putin, I don't think there are some other way to get out from this difficult situation in Russian economy. Also, not only because of the several sanctions by Western countries.
I have a big question,
yes.
Hong Jian.
Yeah.
Despite the free fall in the value of ruble, the Russian currency, despite the severity of the economic sanctions as a result of the Crimea, President Putin still went ahead with a formidable military presence in Syria to help President Bashar defeat ISIL and the Islamic extremists, as well as opposition forces. Where did he get the financial muscles to support his presidential decision?
Yes, I think it will be a big question even for the next term for President Putin. But so far, I think that now we should try to change some criteria to evaluate the Russian economy, just taking use of the GDP or some other. because so far I don't think that Russia is in a normal way to develop its economy. And we can find out more and more Russia will invest into foreign policy and the security policy and also the military force, anything. But I think that it gives a very, very, difficult question to any economist that how could we find out a normal economy in Russia? Because we can find out, yes, so far not yet, independent kind of economic structure besides dependency on the energy. But of course, we can find out a very, very big trend under Putin's administration is try to get out from any dependency on Western economies, especially European economies. It try to give some more space for cooperation with some other, as we know, Asian countries, including China especially. So I think that now it's difficult for us to give an answer to the question, is there any good perspective for Russian economy? But
you seem to have given me an answer. The China lurks behind the whole scenario. We are the biggest market of the oil, the Russian oil and gas. Let me go back to Dr. Yang Cheng from the Shanghai International Studies University. There will be a turnout as high as 81%, and that's a lot, very impressive in the Russian election year. Does it mean, my question is, does it mean the general public in Russia really expect to have a different president by having more of the opposition forces joining the race, or does it mean, Dr. Yang, that most of the constituents and people of the electorate really want to support Putin? They want to turn out, they want to show their public support for Putin. Hence, we have the high turnout of up to 81%. That's very high.
Actually, according to the Russian television, the recent poll, it shows that Putin is in crisis and Putin is in danger. That means they would like to encourage more voters to go to vote for Putin. And as I know, the presidential administration actually has set up two strategic goals. One is to encourage and to have more than 70% of voters to take part in the election. And the second strategic goal is to, among all of the voters, they would like to have more than 70% of voters to vote for Putin. And this will become new resources of legitimacy for Vladimir Putin, who is the second longest president, second longest leader after Stalin in the recent more than 100 years. So I think that actually maybe the popularity of Putin is very high, but in reality maybe there are also a lot, some of trouble. The opposition leaders does not actually challenge Putin himself, but the problem is with Putin himself, because just as Dr. Tree has mentioned, for example, in the economic development strategy, actually there are lack of some new ideas. Even as we know that last December, in the press conference before the public, actually President Putin would like to remind all of the participants that in the last year, it is the first year after the Ukraine crisis, Russian economic growth is more than 1.5% according to different resources. For example, from 1.8 and to 2% of economic growth. But we can say that Russian economic is going beyond the crisis started from 2008, but we cannot say that Putin can and his team can resolve the problem, which is very is related to the economic structure, because the structure is a legacy of the Soviet system, and for more than almost 100 years, even from the Tsarist Russia period, actually Russia cannot resolve the problem, which is very heavily rely on the resources economy, oil and gas, as you also mentioned. This is why actually the voters, I think, is not actually how to say, is not waiting for some new changes in the economic direction, but they would like to see a more stable stability and order is quite important, and also this is two words are also always mentioned by Putin. I think next day, I mean tomorrow, when Putin started a new round of so-called the annual non-traditional annual address of annual state of national address, he will also use this opportunity. He will not join in the debate with the opposition leaders, but he would like to use this opportunity to launch his new president's program.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang.
Thanks. How the people would like to.
Well, let me go to Pavel. President Putin will deliver his State of the Union speech.
Yes.
The question is, how do you estimate the severity of the economic sanctions imposed by European Union and indeed the United States? And to our knowledge, Russia relies on resources, and the resources could have its own curse, the resource curse. And therefore, here are the questions about your economy. You don't have the modern service industry. You don't have modernized industries. You only have your reliance on the export of raw materials such as energy and arms sales. In that case, how could Russia become a modern state, a modern economy?
Well, yes, that's the big question. Putin has been from day one in the Kremlin talking about modernizing Russia, pushing it into the 21st century. But still, Russia is basically exporting commodities. It's not only gas and oil, but it's metals, it's fertilizer, and actually grain. Of course, it's on the one side of it, you can always sell commodities. It's a thing that has a value and it always has a value. On the other side of it, it's, right now the Russian economy is basically stagnating. And how to kickstart it, that's the big problem. The people still give Putin, mass of the Russian people believe that he can pull another kind of something like in the years from 01 to 10, that there's going to be an economic miracle and the economy will begin to grow. But if it doesn't, there's going to be a lot of disappointment. And there's a lot of internal infighting and discussion in the Kremlin how to move Russia forward. Should we continue kind of with the confrontation with the West, or should we find a way to avoid that, to make amends, to get Western investment and Western technologies? Or should we turn to China for investment in technologies and the hell with the West? So, and this is being discussed, and there are internal fights between different fractions in the Kremlin administration, the kind of so-called party of peace and party of war. And the middle ground is Putin, who is kind of trying to find a middle position, a compromise position. And he's going to be speaking about that tomorrow. And I'm afraid it's going to be something much of the same. Well, I mean, if he's 18 years already in power, it's hard to come up with really new ideas. He's going to talk about promoting human capital, about technological and scientific progress, but how to achieve that in the present situation of sanctions, low oil prices, and a lot of mismanagement in the economy.
Thank you so much, Hong Jian.
Yeah.
Russia does not boast of any high-speed railway or whatever kind of spirit of innovation or online payment or e-commerce sharing economy like the shared bicycles that China enjoys. But it does have a strong military and a formidable arsenal of nuclear warheads. Will these military means make Russia become great again? Because that's part of President Putin's ambition, to upgrade Russia to the level of a superpower again. At least it could be the only military force to destroy the United States over and over with a formidable nuclear arsenal.
Yes, exactly. I think to compare with economy, undoubtedly the military and also the defense play a very, dominating role to support a kind of project proposed by Mr. Putin to make Russia great again. and some other. So also we can find that firstly, and Ukraine or Ukrainian crisis become a very, very useful, instrument for President Putin to get some more popularity in domestic politics, and also at the same time to collect any kind of feeling of pride of national from Russian people, and also at the same time, and I think that to keep a kind of a high-level development of a military technology and to have some more investment. Also, this year, 2018, is the first year for this new, national military project by Mr. Putin to give a very, very large investment, especially compared with also in a difficult economic situation. It becomes a very, interesting issue. Say that how could Russia to get so much investment into military project to support its great power position. But of course, I think that now perhaps the question is, I think that for Mr. Putin, for Russian politics, perhaps it has a very different, understanding how about this, structure of power as a country, as a big player in the international arena. But of course, I think that at the same time, it will give another bigger risk for Mr. Putin and his government in next 6 years. Is also, yes, Russia have to invest so much to keep a kind of competition situation with Western countries in military field. But how could Russia avoid any trap, any tragedy? Yeah, copied from Soviet Union.
Many,
kind of military
many
risks.
observers, Chinese, Russian, and American alike, point out recently that the Trump administration, particularly its establishment, are getting mad about listing China as a strategic competitor, forcing China to get even far closer to Russia to form a kind of access against the United States, if not alliance. Having said this, my last question really goes to Pavel Falkenhauer. What about the alleged Russian meddling with the U.S. elections? And do you think the CIA will do much the same in retaliation?
Well, there's not much the CIA can do to prevent President Putin's re-election. Barring any kind of accident that could possibly, theoretically, make him physically incapable. Of running as president. But the Russian, of course, authorities say that this is all kind of invention, and they say that even if there was something, it was such a low scale compared to the enormous amounts of monies of billions of dollars that are spent in American electioneering. What Russia could input and what Russia could spend is such a trifle that this couldn't influence anything. So more or less Moscow is following the line of Donald Trump, that if there was some kind of Russians taking some kind of activity in the American elections, it didn't influence anything and it didn't make him president. So Russia agrees with that. But the problem is that this is becoming increasingly an issue in the United States, and this is going to worsen relations even further, relations that are already right now very, very bad. And that's going to have a big footprint on everything in the world, meaning that Russian and American forces, which are almost already facing each other in the Middle East, can happen, maybe we're facing each other in other parts of the world and other hot spots. And the atmosphere is so bad that it's almost impossible for Russian and American officials to meaningfully have dialogue, because the election issue is overwhelming, and you can't kind of... Moscow, they say the Trump administration can't do anything really to improve relations with Russia.
Thank you so much, Pavel.
Because that would mean that they are colliding.
I know you have a lot of grievances to voice about the
the
Russian meddling, quote unquote.
Thank you.
With that, we come to the end of this discussion about the Russian election on March the 18th. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.